So please, Jim, have a seat next to me. So just a follow-up question on the SDG 12, the responsible consumption and production. Where do you think the sector could do better? Where's there still some work to be done? You mentioned reducing flaring, waste management, etc. Where's there still something to do?
Well, I think in the short term, the positive things that we can do, I did mention, are improving utilization of water, because we do use a fair amount of water. And not just water extraction, but the quality of the water we then put back into the system, so the wastewater treatment processes. And also, and I think you see some of the chemicals companies, some of our members are production companies only, some of them are integrated with upstream, downstream, and chemicals. So where you have the petrochemicals, then there are potentially more efficient ways of producing the petrochemicals inside the production system, so you use less energy, you have better heat integration. So those are obvious things that you can do now.
Would you consider that a low-hanging fruit, easily obtained?
Yes. And then, because I try to marry the low-emission pathways with the Sustainable Development Goals, the big challenge moving medium to longer term is how to reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions. As I said, some of that you can do now, as you call the low-hanging fruit, which is energy efficiency improvements, but that can't get you down to zero emissions within your operations. So you will have to look at the prospect through time of introducing carbon capture and storage. And in some of the petrochemical intermediates, carbon dioxide is a production of the chemical reaction. So it's a process emission, and that will have to be captured and then transported and stored. It's not related to energy use, it's related to chemistry, but it still needs to be captured and stored.
Speaking about CCS, do you think that sort of has the potential of being the leading technology of the future? Do you seriously believe that that could be a part of the problem solving net zero emission?
I think if, as I said, if you look at the scenarios and the projections, they don't call them forecasts, but the scenarios and projections of the IEA, the IPCC, and a lot of academics, they all see within their mitigation pathways out to mid-century and to 2100, they nearly all see a role for carbon capture and storage. The nature of the carbon capture and storage may change over time. So if you wind back 10 years, people talked a lot about the application of carbon capture and storage in coal-fired power generation. And then the focus or the spotlight shifted more towards use of CCS in, again, in the electricity, but with the use of natural gas. Now, those two things may still need to be there in some of the models, but more in other parts of the world, such as China and India, and less so in North America and Europe. And the focus switching now is to what I mentioned, those kind of heavy, difficult to decarbonize heavy industry. So there's a lot of work now where people recognize there's only so much energy efficiency improvement or process changes you can make to cement, that you can make to steel, and that you can make to certain petrochemicals because of chemistry. And cement and steel are critical things to modern life and will continue to be so.
Okay.
And if you want to build wind turbines, you need steel.
Because that was my next question. Which industries would it sort of fit into? Because clearly farming and cows, it doesn't really fit in there. But steel and cement would be sectors that might draw on this technology.
But as you mentioned, agriculture, there are these sectors. They're not related to energy production. People focus on energy and the use of energy. But there are other sectors that produce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's agriculture. And agriculture is about 25% of the global greenhouse gas balance. It's very difficult to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in that. There are some ideas on how to do that. But out towards the second half of the century and beyond to 2100, you may need to be able to get to a net zero carbon approach, which means the agricultural emissions of greenhouse gases still take place, but you have a negative emissions technology which can counterbalance them. Some of that is related to, if you like, to natural solutions, these negative emission technologies, afforestation, reforestation, land use change. And some of it may be related, and you see this in the models, to the application of carbon capture and storage from burning biomass for power generation. And that allows the biomass to take carbon dioxide out of the air. You generate a useful product, which is electricity, capture the CO2 and store it in the ground, so it's a net sink. And those are the sort of technologies, the CCS covering a whole range of these things. It then needs to, I think, have sufficient work on so that people can understand how to make it more effective, more cost effective, and to scale up. Because one of the things when you look at the IPCC report, and again to an extent in the, not just the summary report that came out, but its previous assessment report from 4 years ago, you need to store gigatons of CO2 in the second half of the century. That's a lot of storage. And scaling up to that level is going to be a societal challenge.
So before taking a question or two from the floor, Jim Herbertson, you mentioned it in the beginning that the sector is aiming at a 12% reduction in energy consumption, I think you said.
Yeah.
Would you consider that ambitious enough?
Probably not. I haven't read in detail the latest work from the IEA, nor the summary report from the IPCC, but if you look at one of the illustrative pathways from the IPCC SR 1.5 report, it says that one of these pathways we need to reduce and improve not energy efficiency, but the total amount of energy we use by 15% in the year 2030 compared to the year 2010. That is a huge, huge challenge. Energy efficiency is one of the ways of getting you there, and looking at the illustrative pathway, it's the one that's going to give you the most cost-effective way of getting you there. So yes, people will have to ramp up the level of, not people, but society has to ramp up the level of energy efficiency.
So Jim, now we got that lamp away. That was nice.
Yes, I'm glad everyone's safe.
Good. A question or two for Mr. Jim Herbertson from the floor. Any comments? Yeah.
Yeah, Martin Edwards from Hess. The place of CCS in almost any scenario seems pretty important, but the pace of development of CCS seems very slow, and as you point out, it really needs to take off. So what are the sort of fiscal and structural changes that need to happen for that to occur?
I said right at the beginning, IPCA is not an advocacy organisation. So we don't, in any jurisdiction, talk about prescriptive policies. But what we try and do is kind of just talk about what policy options might be available. And clearly, from our perspective, we, with our members, have said for a long time that you need to put a price on carbon. And that price on carbon needs to be global. It needs to be across the economy, and it needs to be transparent. And until you take that first step, you're not moving along the correct pathway to then look at other policy options that might be able to be built on that.
But maybe we can get a bit closer to answering that question later when we hear about Northern Lights in Norway, hopefully.
But I would say that the oil and gas industry, along with a lot of other folk, are working very, very hard in trying to reduce the costs associated with carbon capture and storage. There are the three elements, and the element that is the most expensive or costly at the moment relates to the capture of the CO2, principally in dilute streams, like from combustion. And the more technology you can bring to bear on a topic, the more likely you are to find a lower cost solution. And that lower cost solution, driven by technology, will help you along the pathway to implementation and deployment.
Good. A final question? No?
There was one over there.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Sorry. Hi, Martina from University of Copenhagen and also the security department in Maastricht. I just have a question, perhaps more long-term and systemic global approach, which is, I'm wondering how you see us reaching the Sustainable Development Goals when the current outlook is that many companies are looking towards frontier and developing countries and exploration in those environments, and kind of effectively making them dependent upon oil and gas revenues and supplies for years to come, and whether you see that as contradicting or even kind of a responsibility for Danish companies to look at. Thank you.
I think, as has been alluded to before, when you look at the, and I pick out the IA Sustainable Development Scenario, that tries to marry meeting the Paris Agreement and implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. And within those Sustainable Development Goals, for parts of the world that do not have access to energy at the moment, I mentioned the 1.1 billion and the people who have poor air quality associated with the use of these solid fuels. You could meet those sustainable development fuels by, for instance, giving them LPG or natural gas. And as part of that, in those countries where those natural resources are available, as IPICA, we work with the OECD. The OECD has a work stream on natural resource extraction, looking at how to make sure you have transparency in the collection and the utilization of revenues from natural resources, not just oil and gas, but mining and metals and other things. And it is up to, and the Paris Agreement takes this into account, as does the SDGs, it's up to each individual country to plot its own path. And for those countries that aren't as rich as the West and don't have the same access to energy as developed countries, then it's incumbent upon them to have the ability to develop those resources, but to develop them within a transparent and clear regulatory framework, so the revenues are used for the benefit of society. And as I said, in the Sustainable Development Scenarios, more natural gas will be needed in 2030 and 2040 than it is today on a global basis. And there will still be a continuing demand for liquid hydrocarbons for oil. So as this is a globe, you try and, if you like, extract the resources where it makes sense to do them. And that in this case, will bring benefits to those societies. You call them frontier, but it will bring benefits to them, as we've seen from the discussion we had earlier.
Excellent.
Okay.
I'm afraid we're running out of time.
It's fine.
Mr. Herbertson, it's been a great pleasure to having you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you
very much for joining us.
Thank you.